Nobody in that room really knew me, not a single soul. To them, I was just Garrick Vance, the quiet one, the intensely detached one, the brother who showed up to family holidays without a wife, without children, and without a single asset worth mentioning during a celebratory New Year's toast. But I learned a fundamental metric a long time ago that most people spend their entire lives failing to comprehend. When you choose to remain entirely silent, people naturally assume you have absolutely nothing. And when they assume you have nothing, they stop paying attention to your movements. That is the exact moment you can build a massive, multi-million-dollar empire right in front of their unblinking eyes, and they will never see the final acquisition coming. I have spent 19 continuous years engineering exactly that reality. I am 51 years old, and I quietly own Vance & Associates Property Group, a dominant commercial real estate and asset management firm operating out of the absolute center of the San Francisco financial district. Welcome to Dad's ultimate payback. Settle into your seat, lock your focus, and keep this unyielding corporate parameter in mind. The people in this narrative had every single opportunity to act with basic human decency. They simply chose otherwise. Do me a critical favor before we pull back the ledger. Hit that like button, drop a detailed comment letting me know exactly what city or state you are watching from, and make absolutely certain you are fully subscribed to the channel. Trust me, you are going to want to track every single line item of this audit. To understand why this night matters, you have to understand the 10% dramatic variable I engineered from the very beginning. For 19 years, I intentionally executed a complete digital and personal blackout with my toxic extended family. I didn't just hide my revenue metrics. I completely hid the existence of my beautiful, brilliant marriage to Martha and our 3 incredible children, Russell, Nora, and Davis. I deliberately chose to let my relatives believe I was a lonely, struggling bachelor, solely to insulate my real family from the superficial, predatory status chasing that defined my bloodline. I built a fortress of absolute invisibility around the people I loved, letting the extended family whisper about my failed life, while I returned home every night to a sanctuary they didn't even possess the security clearance to know existed. The specific evening where the structural load of that 19-year silence finally shifted occurred on December 31st, inside Aunt Eleanor's sprawling, classic Victorian home nestled in the affluent hills of Noe Valley. It is the kind of historic San Francisco neighborhood where the real estate has immense structural character, and the people inside merely pretend to. The house was dense, warm, and suffocatingly loud with the ambient noise of 30 extended family members. A full house of aunts, uncles, and distant cousins playing their respective roles. By 11:50 p.m., Aunt Eleanor began gathering everyone in the grand living room for the mandatory midnight countdown toast. High-end crystal glasses were filled, the volume on the television broadcasting the ball drop was elevated, and that specific, heavy New Year's hush descended over the room. That was the exact moment my younger brother Preston decided to claim the floor. Preston is 45, a flashy, high-volume residential realtor who had just leveraged himself to the absolute legal limit to purchase a status symbol estate in the ultra-wealthy enclave of Atherton. He stepped directly to the center of the room, holding his champagne flute with the practiced, theatrical confidence of a man who has never once paused to consider if the room actually cared to hear his voice. "It's been an incredible high-level year," Preston announced loudly, flashing a brilliant, calculated grin toward his wife, Beatrice. "We officially closed on the Atherton estate. My luxury residential volume is breaking records, and our kids are thriving in elite private tracks. Some of us in this room are truly discovering what it means to win." Then, right on cue, he turned his body 90 degrees and locked his predatory, arrogant eyes directly onto mine, ensuring every single guest in the room followed his gaze. "And then, of course, we have some people like my older brother, Garrick," Preston continued, his easy smile spreading into a vicious, mocking sneer. "Some of us hit 51 years old with no wife, no children, still driving the exact same dented sedan, and possessing absolutely nothing to show for 5 full decades on this earth. But hey, at least you had the courage to show up tonight, right, big brother? Must be incredibly tough watching the rest of us actually build something permanent. We keep waiting for you to figure out how the real world works, Garrick." The grand Noe Valley living room plunged into an immediate, horrified vacuum of total silence. It was the specific, crushing variety of silence that materializes when a public insult has gone entirely too far, leaving 30 guests frozen in place, their eyes darting nervously between the wealthy residential realtor and the quiet brother standing by the fireplace. Beatrice smiled tightly into her crystal glass, while Aunt Eleanor's face went entirely pale, her worried eyes cutting straight across the room toward me with a look of profound, silent apology. Preston aggressively raised his champagne flute directly in my direction, tilting it with a theatrical, mocking flourish, as if inviting the entire room to join in on the joke, explicitly transforming my life into the ultimate punchline of his evening entertainment. I remained completely, unnervingly unmoved. My pulse didn't accelerate by a single beat per minute, and the expression on my face stayed at absolute freezing room temperature. I slowly, methodically extended my arm and set my glass of sparkling water down onto the marble side table, ensuring my movements were entirely unhurried and my hands were completely free. I didn't look at Preston. Instead, I turned directly to my aunt, offering her a calm, remarkably warm smile that carried zero performative distortion. Eleanor, that prime rib dinner was absolutely spectacular, easily the finest culinary work you've executed this decade. Aunt Eleanor blinked in absolute shock at my total lack of retaliation, before letting out a massive, visible sigh of relief. "Thank you so much, baby," she whispered, her voice trembling slightly. Behind me, the television countdown reached its final metrics. 3, 2, 1. The room instantly erupted into chaotic New Year's noise, guests leaning into one another, glasses clinking, and the tension dissolving superficially for everyone else in the room. Preston turned back to his corporate circle, laughing loudly as if he had just won the ultimate victory over my character. I watched his back as he walked away, a slow, cold smile finally tracing the corners of my mouth. Preston comfortingly believed he had just delivered a devastating psychological verdict to an aging loser. He had absolutely zero operational comprehension that his unmitigated, arrogant pride had just run up a massive compliance bill. A financial and legal debt that my firm was scheduled to collect in exactly 3 days. 3 days into the new year, the thick, freezing San Francisco fog rolled aggressively off the Pacific, blanketing the towering skyscrapers of the financial district in a dense sheet of gray obscurity. By exactly 7:15 a.m., I was already seated at my custom executive desk on the 32nd floor, operating in a state of absolute corporate tranquility. A cup of dark roast coffee from the small artisanal shop on Hawthorne sat steaming next to my monitors, its aroma filling the quiet room. I have always been a man who notices the micrometrics of his environment. At this early hour, the city below was silent, hidden beneath the shifting mist, providing the perfect, undisturbed backdrop for an empire built entirely on precision and discretion. I was systematically reviewing our first quarter commercial asset projections when my private smartphone vibrated on the polished mahogany surface at exactly 9:47 a.m. I looked down at the display and watched Preston's name flash repeatedly against the glass. I let it ring twice, not out of a theatrical desire for suspense, but because a seasoned auditor always requires 2 seconds to calibrate which precise version of himself needs to answer the call. When I clicked the receiver and placed it to my ear, the transformation was instantaneous. Preston's usual booming, hyper-confident voice, the loud, space-consuming cadence he routinely weaponized to dominate family gatherings, was completely hollow, stripped of every single ounce of its elite Atherton bravado. "Garrick? Fred? You there?" he stammered, his breathing shallow and erratic. "I'm just going to say it straight. The San Jose condo development contract, the multi-million-dollar anchor project for my entire firm, it completely collapsed overnight. The primary institutional developer pulled their funding out with zero warning. It's done, Garrick. It's entirely gone." The heavy silence that unspooled over the line was absolute, stretching out like a brittle wire. I leaned back into my ergonomic leather chair, keeping my posture completely relaxed and my expression entirely blank, as Preston began pacing on the other end, his frantic footsteps echoing through the receiver. "Look, man, I wouldn't be calling your line if I had a single alternative operational option. You know that," he admitted, his voice cracking as the raw panic of his situation began to bleed through the speaker. "My primary sub-vendors are demanding immediate clearing of their invoices by next week. My payroll accounts are completely dry, and if I cannot secure a massive infusion of emergency liquid capital within 72 hours, I am facing absolute catastrophic corporate bankruptcy. Everything is riding on this. Yet, even while drowning in a sea of his own structural failures, Preston's toxic, conditioned arrogance attempted to re-establish a baseline of dominance. He cleared his throat, trying desperately to shift into an alpha negotiation posture. So look, big brother, I was thinking we could structure a high-yield private loan agreement. I'll give you a decent return, far better than whatever low-tier index funds you've got your little savings tied up in. It's a win-win for you. I let a cold, slow smile trace my face in the dim office light. Preston was completely, blissfully blind to the reality that my firm's compliance department had spent the last 48 hours compiling a comprehensive forensic risk report on his business, mapping out every single layer of his hidden, toxic financial leverage and over-collateralized debts. He thought he was throwing a lifeline to a struggling bachelor. He had no idea I already held the complete ledger of his imminent demise. "Come to my office tomorrow morning at 9 a.m. sharp, Preston," I dictated coolly, my voice completely room temperature, cutting off his frantic negotiation mid-sentence. "Do not be late." He was late, of course. It was exactly 9:18 a.m. when the senior receptionist dialed my private line to inform me that my younger brother had finally arrived in the main lobby. I instructed her to send him up immediately, swiveled my executive chair toward the formal entrance, and watched through the expansive glass walls of my office suite as the elevator doors pulled open on the 32nd floor. Preston stepped out into the sleek, high-end reception area and froze completely solid. The polished stone floors, the museum-grade artwork, and the massive wraparound windows offering a towering, unobstructed view of the Golden Gate Bridge piercing through the morning fog hit him like a wall of freezing water. I watched him take a slow, unsteadied step forward, his eyes tracking across the architectural grandeur of the space, before locking onto the brushed steel corporate logo mounted permanently onto the main glass partition, Vance & Associates Property Group. I watched the exact millisecond the psychological realignment shattered his consciousness. The color drained from his face in real time, his mouth parting slightly as the staggering, impossible truth finally penetrated his ego. In one terrifying, unexecutable moment, the flashy residential realtor realized that the quiet, isolated brother he had spent 2 continuous decades treating like an object of financial charity, the man he had explicitly mocked just 3 nights ago as an aging loser with nothing to show for his life, actually owned the dominant, multi-billion-dollar commercial real estate empire controlling the entire Northern California region. The master architect had finally stepped out of the shadows, and Preston was standing completely defenseless in his boardroom. I stepped out of my private office, buttoned the center tab of my tailored suit jacket, and walked into the reception area to meet my brother. Preston was still standing rooted to the polished stone floor, his eyes darting frantically across the high-end artwork and the sprawling views of the Bay Area. "Fred, Garrick, what is all of this? How long have you—" He gestured vaguely at the space around him, his voice cracking slightly. "Come on back, Preston," I interrupted, my tone entirely flat and clinical. I guided his stunned, sluggish frame past the open trading floor, navigating through rows of busy compliance analysts and asset managers. For Preston, walking through this high-performance corporate landscape felt like navigating a reality he had been profoundly wrong about his entire life. Good. I opened the heavy mahogany door to our executive boardroom and gestured for him to enter. He took 3 steps inside and stopped so violently he almost tripped over his own feet. Sitting immaculately at the absolute head of the polished boardroom table, looking intensely elegant with a cup of hot tea and a matte black leather portfolio open beside her, was Martha. Preston instantly lost his breath, the remaining color draining from his face like water through a sieve. 22 years prior, long before I had built my empire, Preston had brutally dumped Martha in the rainy asphalt parking lot of a cheesecake factory in Beaverton, explicitly telling her to her face that she was too simple, too middle class, and severely lacked the elite social status required to match his high-flying future. He had discarded her like a low-tier commodity. Now, the ghost of his past was sitting on a throne of commercial capital, staring directly back into his panicked eyes. The silence that followed inside the boardroom was one of the most structurally complete vacuums I have ever witnessed in my 51 years on Earth. Preston didn't move a muscle, his lips parting and closing silently as his brain desperately scrambled to recalibrate. Martha looked up calmly from her open portfolio, met his frantic eyes, and delivered a room-temperature smile that was completely warm, unruffled, and utterly devastating. It was as if she had been expecting him all morning. I walked to the opposite side of the mahogany table, pulled out a leather chair, and sat down. From a secure manila folder, I extracted a series of high-quality, glossy photographs and slid them aggressively across the polished wood toward my brother. Preston looked down, his trembling hands gripping the edge of the table as he stared at the first image. It was a beautiful, sunlit photograph of Garrick and Martha on their wedding day in San Francisco back in the spring of 2005, surrounded by blooming cherry blossoms. The secondary photos detailed our three brilliant children: Russell, now 14 and taller than me, Nora, 11 and sharp as a tactical razor, and little Davis, 8 years old and built like a small freight train. I let the visual data settle heavily into his consciousness before I spoke. "Meet my wife Preston," I said, letting the singular word echo off the glass walls with absolute structural weight. In one clean, clinical motion, the entire foundation of his New Year's Eve verdict in Noe Valley, his entire mocking toast about me being a lonely single loser with nothing to show for his life, was completely, irrevocably invalidated. Preston shifted his weight, his knuckles turning stark white against the mahogany as he tried to find his voice. The elite Atherton realtor was gone. What remained was a desperate, compromised debtor trying to run a damage control script. "Martha, Look, I didn't know," he stammered, his eyes darting between the photos and her face. "Back then, I was young. I was an idiot. I said things in that parking lot that I had absolutely no business saying to you. I want to sincerely apologize for." Martha didn't let him finish the transaction. She raised her hand slightly, cutting through his desperate, stammering apology with the ultimate chilling grace of a senior executive closing a dead file. "I stopped needing your apology a very long time ago, Preston," she stated calmly, her voice as smooth and unyielding as river water. "I have a beautiful, exceptionally full life, and I have zero interest in revisiting your old delusions." She paused for exactly 1 second, her eyes shifting toward me with a profound, quiet pride that had anchored my chest for 19 continuous years. "My husband ensured that my dignity and my life were completely protected from people like you." Martha systematically closed her leather portfolio with a definitive snap, smoothed the front of her tailored jacket, and stood up to her full height. She walked out of the boardroom without looking back once, the door clicking softly into place behind her. The performance was officially over, and Preston was left entirely alone in the room with the master auditor, facing the immediate collection of his historical bill. The heavy mahogany door clicked shut, sealing the boardroom in an absolute, impenetrable silence. The view of the Golden Gate Bridge cutting through the morning fog remained spectacular, but inside, the atmosphere had shifted into the sterile, freezing room temperature of a federal audit. I leaned forward slowly, resting my elbows on the polished wood of the table, and opened the dense black ledger that contained the true, unvarnished history of our relationship. I locked my eyes onto Preston, my voice dead calm, completely stripped of any familial warmth. "Let us begin the quantitative analysis of your survival, Preston," I said, my voice barely above a whisper but carrying the crushing weight of an iron beam. "We will start by extracting the historical data from March 2009. Preston shifted uncomfortably, his eyes darting toward the closed door, as if looking for an exit strategy. "Garrick, look, that was a lifetime ago," he began, but I raised a single hand, instantly freezing him mid-sentence. "In March 2009, your residential real estate hustle had completely flatlined," I stated with clinical precision. "You were exactly 4 months behind on your rent. Your landlord had already filed the formal eviction paperwork, and Beatrice was heavily pregnant with your first child. You were hours away from being thrown onto the street, completely bankrupt. You called me at 11 p.m., weeping, begging for a lifeline, and by exactly 7 a.m. the very next morning, the entire outstanding balance was fully wired into your account." I leaned closer, letting the next metric land. But because your pride was too fragile to accept assistance from the brother you looked down on, I spent thousands extra to route those funds through a shell corporation, disguising the entire bailout as an anonymous institutional bank restructuring program. You literally went to sleep a failure and woke up thinking the universe had simply smiled on your destiny. You were living on my hidden grace before your first child even drew his first breath. Preston's jaw tightened, a dark defensive flush spreading across his neck as he tried to claw back some semblance of his usual corporate bravado. Fine, you helped us out once, when times were lean. Every family does that. But I built my own success after that, Garrick. The 2015 expansion loan was entirely my own commercial brilliance. I secured that capital because of my own reputation in the Bay Area. I let out a short, cold breath that wasn't quite a laugh, reached into the folder, and pulled out a certified credit allocation agreement, flipping it directly to the master index signature page. Let us audit the precise metrics of January 2015, I said, sliding the document across the mahogany until it tapped against his trembling knuckles. Take a look at the secondary signatory line, I commanded flatly. Preston leaned forward, his eyes scanning the legal text before freezing completely on the bottom margin. You threw a massive, obscenely expensive launch party at a country club in Silicon Valley to celebrate that loan, I reminded him, my voice cutting through his rising panic like a surgical blade. You stood on a stage with a microphone, bragging to 50 elite investors that you had finally forced the major financial institutions to believe in your individual brilliance. But the raw data proves otherwise, Preston. The bank's risk department had already formally rejected your application. The only reason that multi-million-dollar line of credit was ever approved was because I personally stepped into the shadows and placed my own private commercial assets up as absolute collateral to guarantee your debt. I called in a massive institutional favor I had been holding for 3 years just to keep your business from dying in the cradle. You stood on a stage and took the applause for a reality that I paid for. You only existed in the market because of my hidden mercy. The silence that settled over the boardroom was absolute, the heavy reality of the ledger completely crushing the last remaining fragments of Preston's entitled persona. The photos of my wedding, the images of my 3 thriving children, and the massive weight of the multi-million-dollar bailouts sat on the table between us like an unassailable mountain of evidence. I sat back slowly in my leather executive chair, folding my hands over my chest, my gaze remaining entirely locked onto my younger brother's pale, defeated face. I want you to think very carefully about the specific vocabulary you used during your formal toast in Noe Valley just 3 nights ago, I said, my voice dropping into a deep, clinical register. You stood in front of 30 people and explicitly labeled me an aging, single loser who had absolutely nothing to show for 5 decades on this earth. You invited the entire room to laugh at my expense, using my quiet lifestyle as the ultimate punchline to validate your own arrogant, leveraged existence. I paused for a long moment, letting the sheer hypocrisy of the memory suffocate the room. I did not extract these forensic receipts today to cause you emotional damage, Preston. I extracted them because, as a compliance director, I cannot tolerate an uncorrected error in the ledger. I brought you into this boardroom to ensure you fundamentally understand what less than actually looks like. It is not the quiet man who builds a permanent empire in the shadows while protecting his family. It is the loud, flashy parasite who lives in a leased Atherton mansion funded by bank fraud, begging for a bridge loan from the very brother he publicly insulted. Quote, for the first time in his entire 51 years on Earth, Preston sat in a multi-million-dollar boardroom completely stripped of his voice, staring at the receipts of a debt he could never possibly repay. The air in the 32nd floor boardroom remained dead, heavy, and completely stripped of oxygen as Preston stared blankly at the historical financial records scattered across the mahogany table. I let him sit in the wreckage of his own illusions for another 3 seconds before I closed the black ledger with a sharp, definitive slap that made him flinch. The past is an audited asset, Preston. Now let us address your immediate operational insolvency, I stated, my voice resuming its flat, clinical compliance cadence. I will not wire you a single dollar from my personal accounts. However, because you are blood, I will provide a pathway to survival. I have already contacted Pacific Northwest Capital, a high-level, aggressive institutional lender that owes my firm several massive structural favors. They are prepared to execute an emergency bridge loan facility by tomorrow afternoon. The capital will fully cover your immediate vendor liabilities, clear your outstanding payroll blocks, and temporarily halt your bankruptcy timeline. Preston's eyes flashed with a sudden, desperate surge of relief, his shoulders dropping as he prepared to thank me, completely blind to the reality that a professional auditor never offers a rescue package without locking the trap. "Do not miscalculate this transaction," I cut in, my voice dropping into a freezing, low register. "This bridge loan is not a gift. It is a predatory corporate receivership. As an absolute condition of the capital injection, my chief operations officer, Kevin, the most ruthless forensic investigator on my payroll, will permanently embed himself inside your firm for the next 14 days. Kevin will possess unrestricted administrative authority to completely dissect, audit, and control every single one of your back-end accounts, your vendor ledgers, and your private routing logs. If he uncovers a single line item of mismanagement, my firm will immediately invoke the default clauses, seize your remaining corporate equity, and liquidate what is left of your business. You are either going to learn how to operate legally under my absolute oversight, or I am going to erase your firm from the market entirely." The raw, terrifying scale of the trap slammed into Preston with visible physical force. The realization washed over his pale face that in order to keep Beatrice and his children from being thrown out onto the street, in order to prevent his entire leveraged lifestyle from undergoing immediate, public liquidation, he was being forced to hand over the absolute keys to his entire professional existence to the very brother he had dismissed as furniture just 3 nights ago. He sat frozen, looking down at the legal operational access forms I had placed directly on top of the photographs of my thriving children. I leaned forward slightly, looking through his panic with an absolute, unyielding clarity. "This is the core, unalterable difference between our individual architectures, Preston," I whispered, the words cutting through the boardroom like an industrial scalpel. "You spent 2 continuous decades draining your cash flow and committing bank fraud because you desperately needed the external world to think you were important. You needed the luxury cars, the Atherton address, and the loud New Year's toasts to validate your ego. I spent 19 years operating in absolute invisibility because I simply needed my empire to be real. You built a stage, I engineered a foundation." Preston's jaw worked silently, his chest heaving, as the absolute truth of the statement broke whatever remained of his resistance. He slowly reached out, grabbed the heavy Mont Blanc pen from the center of the table, and signed his name across the administrative access lines. I watched his hands shake violently against the paper, his signature erratic and unraveled as he formally signed away the final remnants of his autonomy. I methodically gathered the signed access forms, placed them back inside my secure corporate portfolio, and stood up from the mahogany table, buttoning the center tab of my tailored jacket. The audit was officially complete. Preston slowly, sluggishly rose from his leather chair, his movements carrying the heavy, exhausted exhaustion of a man who had just survived a massive tectonic crash. He stood in the center of the vast glass-walled room, looking around the towering corporate office one final time, his eyes tracking the rows of busy analysts, the high-end minimalist architecture, and the sprawling view of the San Francisco Bay Area clearing beneath the morning fog. For the first time in 19 years, he was actually seeing the massive multi-billion-dollar scale of the life he had been completely blind to. He turned toward the boardroom exit, his head hung low, and walked slowly down the long carpeted hallway toward the executive elevator bank. I followed him out, maintaining a quiet, professional distance. As the polished steel elevator doors slid open, Preston paused. He didn't step inside immediately. Instead, he slowly turned his frame around, looking back at me with an expression that was entirely raw, unguarded, and stripped of every single ounce of his lifelong arrogance. His eyes were glassy, tracking my face with the look of a man recalculating the last 20 years of his existence in real time. "For what it's worth, Garrick," he whispered, his voice dropping into a rough, trembling register that I had never heard from him before. "I'm genuinely proud of you, man. I should have said that a very long time ago." I looked at my younger brother standing inside the steel enclosure, looking smaller and more honest than he had ever been in his entire life. I kept my face at absolute room temperature, my voice level and unhurried as the elevator doors began to close between us. "Get home safe, Preston," I replied coolly. "The roads are slick." The operational restructuring of Preston's firm under Kevin's unyielding oversight rolled forward over the next 90 days with the devastating automated efficiency of a liquidation protocol. In order to satisfy the rigid risk parameters executed by Pacific Northwest Capital and prevent immediate bankruptcy filing, Preston and Beatrice were forced to undergo a catastrophic public dissolution of their upper-class status. The massive, heavily leveraged mansion in the ultra-exclusive enclave of Atherton was quietly rushed onto the market, its forced sale clearing only a fraction of their predatory debt liabilities. The luxury European vehicles were aggressively repossessed, and the entirety of their performative country club existence evaporated from the Bay Area grid. The siblings were forced to execute a permanent lifestyle downsizing strategy, completely relocating their broken domestic infrastructure into a modest, double-occupancy rental property located 45 minutes northeast in the working-class, industrial suburb of Vallejo. Yet, the true 10% dramatic metric of this structural correction manifested directly within the reality of their 13-year-old son, Mason. His enrollment at the elite, hyper-competitive private academy in Silicon Valley, an institution his parents had desperately used as a social shield to mask their severe financial insolvency, was permanently terminated. Mason was transitioned directly into the local municipal public school system in Vallejo, stripped entirely of the toxic, entitled scripts that had poisoned his behavior by the fence line in Noe Valley. Separated from the artificial upper-class echo chamber, the boy was finally forced to confront the unvarnished reality of the real world, far removed from the predatory arrogance his parents had cultivated at their dinner table. Exactly 3 months after the closing statement was delivered in the financial district boardroom, the true human realignment of the situation unspooled. I was sitting at the kitchen island in our Steiner Ranch sanctuary on a quiet Tuesday evening when my private smartphone lit up on the counter. It was a secure text communication from Martha, containing a high-resolution photograph of a handwritten letter Beatrice had left at Aunt Eleanor's estate. But before I could even zoom in to read the lines, a secondary notification chimed. I looked down at the display and watched a direct message materialize from Preston, sent not to my corporate accounts, but directly to my intensely guarded private cell line. I want to be completely precise about the structure of this message. It carried absolutely zero traces of his historical real estate bravado, no calculated marketing rhetoric, and no desperate pleas for a secondary capital injection. It was the first entirely honest, unchoreographed transaction of his adult life. Garrick. The encrypted text read on the screen, the words stark and heavy in the quiet room. Kevin completed the asset restructuring today and officially handed back control. I sat in my office for 3 hours looking at the numbers, and I finally realized the absolute truth. My entire life for 20 years has been a complete, exhausting illusion. I built a stage out of bad debt just to feel big, while you built a reality. I am deeply, profoundly sorry for the toast in Noe Valley. I was talking to a version of you that I fabricated because my own pride was rotting out from the inside. You saved my family from the street, when you had every legal right to let us drown. I don't expect a return to the old family holidays, but I needed you to know the truth. I stared at the digital ledger on the screen, realizing that by stripping away his unearned subsidies, my compliance audit had successfully forced our sibling relationship onto a clean, purified foundation of absolute truth for the first time in 51 years. The following Friday afternoon found me sitting in my private, upper-level executive office, the structural space that doesn't show up on the master company directory, meticulously decorated by Martha because she always claimed my personal aesthetic ran toward aggressively boring shades of corporate beige. The persistent San Francisco fog had completely cleared over the bay, leaving the vast blue water shining brilliantly beneath long, quiet strips of pale winter light. The Golden Gate Bridge stood out in sharp, uncompromised relief against the horizon, a monument of absolute engineering stability. My smartphone buzzed softly on the desk, displaying a text message from Martha. How did the final closing meeting go with the bank analysts? Are we clear? I picked up the device, a slow, deep sense of total serenity settling into my chest cavity as I looked out at the peaceful city below. I tapped the keyboard, my fingers moving with calm certainty. He finally knows. Every single line item is balanced. Tell Davis yes to the tacos for dinner tonight. I'll be home by 6 o'clock. I set the phone face down onto the dark wood. I realized, with absolute structural clarity, that some people spend their entire, exhausting lives making continuous volatile noise just to desperately feel significant to a crowd of strangers. I had spent 19 continuous years operating in absolute silence, quietly, methodically engineering something completely permanent for the people who carried my name. My name is Garrick Vance. I am 51 years old. My foundation is clean, my assets are secured, and my family is completely, unassailably real. If you found this forensic deconstruction of family entitlement, silent execution, and absolute structural justice deeply satisfying, do your own life metrics a massive favor right now. Slam that like button with absolute certainty. Drop a detailed comment below letting me know exactly what city, state, or country you are monitoring this broadcast from, and ensure you are fully, permanently subscribed to Dad's Ultimate Payback. We have an entire system of calculated, unyielding, and profoundly rewarding audits waiting for you in our master database. Thank you for scanning the line items with us tonight, and I will officially see you on the very next procurement report.